Hello, I'm Ryan, and welcome to Analyze This, Mr. Bond. This is part 4 of a 5-part series where I've been looking at the Daniel Craig Bond films and the connective tissue between them. I believe that the Daniel Craig movies have a fairly consistent view of Bond's psychology, and that's really what unites his arc across all 5 movies. And today we are talking about Spectre. Spectre is in some ways the messiest and most sprawling Bond movie that Craig did. It has the most ideas, and they don't all elegantly fit into the narrative structure that Spectre uses. So, whereas with previous films, I was able to kind of, shoot from the hip with these videos, I mostly just turned the camera on and started speaking and felt confident in my ability to tell a fairly clear narrative. With Spectre, you will see that I am referencing notes, and that is because there's just so much going on in this movie that I need a bit to focus my mind here with what the film is doing, how it's working, and let's just start at the start of Spectre and kind of work our way into it. Spectre is a film that takes the name Spectre literally. It is a ghost story for James Bond. You feel that very clearly from the outset. The 007 gun barrel logo rolls across the screen, and then we get the most pretentious thing to happen in any of the Daniel Craig Bond movies. We get a title card that tells us the dead are alive. We've never had any moment like that in any of the prior Bond films, but it kind of clues you in that Spectre's going to follow a different sort of mode than prior Bond films. This is going to go its own way, and that's for good and bad. But who are the dead that sentence is talking about? This is a film populated by ghosts. We have the ghost of M, a digital ghost, so to speak, giving Bond orders from beyond the grave. We have Oberhauser / Blofeld, I might just call him Bloferhauser from now on, who has returned from Bond's past to menace him in the present, and is presented directly as a sort of ghostly silhouetted figure visually throughout the film. We have Spectre itself. But I want to suggest that the dead are alive. That the dead that it's talking about is James Bond himself. Bond is a dead man walking at the start of this movie. He is introduced to us as a human skeleton. That is his introduction into this movie. That is a visual metaphor that could almost not be any clearer. Realigning himself to being an assassin at the end of Skyfall has essentially made him death incarnate. We've talked about before how in the prior Craig films he is kind of bifurcated between Bond the man, Bond the assassin, and to be Bond the assassin is to be associated with death. His arc in this movie is going to be about him throwing the gun away, rejecting his role as an assassin, refusing to be an assassin. That is what he does in the final moment. He gets the villain and then just refuses to execute him. This Bond, therefore, starts at a place where he has fully embraced this role for himself. He is effectively a dead, haunted man at the start of Spectre. And it's something that visually the movie is doing a lot with. There's a sort of gothic atmosphere throughout the movie. And the costuming, and I don't think I'm reading too much into this, he's introduced as a skeleton figure early in the movie, and then that motif kind of carries through a little bit. The sunglasses Craig's Bond wears throughout these movies have a sort of distinct, especially when worn on his face, like a skull eye socket vibe, almost emphasizing that he's still in that place. He's wearing a lot of black. He's especially in the Rome and clinic sequences, so his wardrobe starts to change once he meets Madeleine, and I think that is potentially a very intentional choice on the part of the costume designer of Spectre. But we see that he's, after Skyfall, he's thrown himself into the work, not in the way that he did in Quantum of Solace. Quantum of Solace, he was kind of a workaholic mode, suppressing all his emotion just by working as frantically as he can, and in a very unhealthy space. In this, he is a man who is in a kind of weird, hazy limbo, right? We get this sense very early on in the movie when we see Bond's apartment. Bond's apartment, after getting all his stuff back, is hardly assembled. He's not a man living. Moneypenny will will later in the film chastise him about how she has a life, and Bond really hasn't reclaimed his. He's a man who is kind of following on the purpose given to him by the M he failed to save. And one of the defenses people give of Quantum of Solace, which I don't fully buy into, but that the frantic editing and kind of chaotic style of that movie is meant to reflect Bond's chaotic and emotional headspace, like chaotic, psychological and emotional headspace. If we apply that same principle to Spectre, it almost follows in an interesting way. It starts to explain why this movie is so often weirdly dreamlike in a way that other Craig movies are not. There is a very heightened style to this movie. You get, for example, the Eyes Wide Shut style introduction of the Spectre organization, which feels highly unique for the series and feels like it's doing something radically different than we got with the introduction of the Quantum organization and Quantum of Solace during the opera sequence, which was also very grand, but it didn't have this sort of ethereal quality. And a lot of the imagery in this movie has that ethereal quality. In fact, the major sequence that we'll talk about later when we get to the Madeleine relationship, Bond's torture and escape with Madeleine, almost thrives on a sense of dream logic that is very hard to find a parallel to in this series. And we'll talk about that scene very very clearly later. I think it's a weird scene, and I think a lot of folks don't quite understand how it's working, but there is some logic to its madness. So if that's where Bond is at the start of this movie, let's talk about his core relationships to the world around him. And I'm just going to be clear from the outset. I'm not going to talk too much about the pieces of the movie that have to do with C or MI6 being replaced by the Nine Eyes Initiative. I think that's all very clear. It fits into this idea that Bond is confronted with the sort of same conflict he was confronted with in Skyfall, that he's being made obsolete, and that time is moving forward, and he's kind of standing still. I think that's what that idea is about. I don't think we need to dwell on that idea very much. And in fact, I think the C storyline is perhaps the piece of Spectre that holds the movie back the most, because I think the rest of it kind of works together. And I think if you take the C storyline back in London kind of out of the movie hangs together a lot better. But that piece is there. I've said thematically what that piece is doing. I don't plan to touch on that very much in the rest of my analysis, so that'll just be a gap. I just don't think there's much to be said about it. So let's talk about Bond's relationship to Judi Dench's M. He's pursuing essentially her dying wish at the start of Spectre. This is an idea that's kind of interesting because Skyfall feels like it's resolved her death and it could have moved on from it. And now suddenly we have this strand carrying forward, and it's almost like it's revisiting the aftershocks of that in the same way that Quantum of Solace decided to not move forward from Vesper's death, but really kind of think about it a little bit more. And what this movie is doing with her and her giving this mission to Bond is it essentially reinforces the idea that Skyfall gave us, which is that her relationship to Bond is tied to Bond's childhood trauma, right? Bond being an orphan is the reason he has this strong emotional connection to Judi Dench's M. She is a surrogate parent. And so that in Spectre, just like in Skyfall, we find that her end is tied to Bond's beginning. Her dying wish is essentially tied to Bond's quest to confront the ghosts of his past once more. It's a repetitive idea, but it is the same core idea, which is that Bond's relationship to M, Judi Dench's M, I should be specific, is this sort of is loaded with this baggage about Bond's own childhood drama. And it's not a revenge crusade for him. He's doing it really out of in this case, out of a sense of duty. It feels like he's a much more resigned in it. Like we've said, he's kind of a dead man walking. There's a sort of resignation, a sort of subdued quality to Bond in this movie, where he is executing the motions on instinct. He'll say to Madeleine later in the movie that he just doesn't think about anything else anymore, right? He just doesn't stop to think about it, is essentially the way he puts it. He is just going through the machinations because this is what he knows. This is what is giving him purpose. And I think that's very interesting. The film does not substantially dwell on his connection to M, though characters will keep kind of bringing up this idea that her loss was a huge wound for Bond. And I think it defines how unique his relationship is to Judi Dench's M as opposed to the Ralph Fiennes M, Mallory. I think Bond's relationship to Mallory is much more symbolically about Bond's relationship to the British government. And we see that in the way the Mallory character is introduced in Skyfall. He's a government official. We see that in the way that Mallory conducts himself in Spectre, and I think in No Time to Die, that becomes a very potent, loaded idea that Ralph Fiennes' M is very much an authority figure that is speaking for the institution itself in a way that Bond's relationship with Judi Dench's M didn't. They both, Judi Dench's M and Bond both felt like outsiders together a little bit, and they were always presented as such in their three film arc. So now that we've touched on that, let's touch on the other big ghost of the movie, and that is Oberhauser / Blofeld, Bloferhauser. He's a ghostly figure. He's introduced into the movie physically at the funeral, right? The funeral where Bond crashes at in Rome, right? Which is a very kind of spooky sequence. I also want to mention that there's an interesting strand in the Daniel Craig Bond movies of pulling from not just settings in Italy, but a lot of the sort of religious architecture of the past. The big key example of this is the chapel on the Bond estate at the end of Skyfall. That is a very pivotal location for that climax. And it's interesting that one thing that's consistent and I don't know how aware the writers and producers were about this, is that Daniel Craig's James Bond continually describes himself as his purpose would either be to be an assassin or to be like a priest. And you see this line in Casino Royale that he would either like that M wants him to be half monk, half hitman, and then you have the line at the start of Quantum of Solace about like how the CIA is upset that they got Le Chiffre's dead body in the exchange, and Bond was like, well, if they you know, they should have made a deal with a priest if they really wanted his soul. And then again in this movie, when he's talking to Madeleine, he again talks about like, well, if I hadn't been this, I would have been a priest. And it's interesting that the priest is also a very singularly focused individual, a character who is performing last rites. So a character who is isolated from the world, dedicated to a cause, identified with death. It's interesting that Bond's self-image thinks in terms of either assassin or priest, and it's interesting to think about the potential similarities between those. It's not a big idea in these movies, but it's recurrent enough that's interesting, and it kind of adds a layer of interesting resonance to the way that this movie in particular is pulling upon the religiously infused atmosphere of Rome. I mean, the Vatican gets a big moment too. So visually during the car chase, so it's kind of interesting that the movie is playing with that a little bit as atmosphere. And so he meets Blofeld for the first time there, and Blofeld is kind of in silhouette, and then Blofeld is in silhouette again when he's introduced during the very dreamlike, surreal Spectre meeting. And the Spectre meeting, as again, I like the reference point seems to me to be like kind of like an Eyes Wide Shut style secret society. It's very Illuminati-esque as opposed to this sort of more evil corporation effect that you got suggested with Quantum. Here it's less of a corporation and more of this like sinister, again, spectral entity, right? And the way Blofeld is built into this movie is he's really, again, James Bond's shadow self. That's made very literal. He's Bond's half-brother, which suggests a sort of sibling rivalry, a sort of sibling mirroring. But he, in very real terms, brings once again this idea of family trauma back up to the surface of Bond. Not just because he's tied to Bond's childhood experience, but because Blofeld is presented in this movie as a man who has kind of destroyed his own family and remade it, right? He has killed his own father. He has chosen his own name. He's adopted a persona, right? And we've talked a little bit, too, about how this version of Bond has also adopted a persona, that he's kind of bifurcated, and the James Bond 007 assassin persona is kind of a created identity that he puts on, almost like Batman adopting the Batsuit. And so it's kind of interesting that this mirroring occurs between him and Blofeld in terms of these created identities they've assumed in reaction to their childhoods. So that's a very interesting parallel between the two of them. And Blofeld is very obsessed with talking about family in these movies, and it even carries forward into No Time to Die. I thought maybe after this movie they would move away from it, but Blofeld is very preoccupied with seeing Bond in the terms of family, and also kind of destroying Bond's future in the terms of family. So he's talking about how the women Bond has loved has died, mostly because of his machinations behind the scenes and all the things that he has controlled over the years. He's talking about Madeleine and, you know, the delight he takes in potentially destroying Bond's relationship with Madeleine, who might be the only woman who could understand Bond. We'll talk about that kind of connection between Madeleine and Bond in a second. And the climax there is of that relationship, and I think one very good scene in Spectre that doesn't get talked about a lot, but I think is one of the few moments in Spectre where there's a real good electric charge of character connection, is the three of them in the room, and Blofeld is showing Madeleine the video of Mr. White's death. And Bond quickly realizes what Blofeld is doing, that Blofeld is doing this to kind of traumatize Madeleine. And Bond, obviously, who has baggage about his own parents' death and knows that Madeleine has, you know, we'll talk about this a little bit, pretty significant quote-unquote daddy issues, has a moment of, like, deep panic and tries to get Blofeld to shut it off. And Blofeld obviously won't shut it off. Bond doesn't have the power, but what he's able to do is he's able to connect with Madeleine through her eyes. They're able to look at each other, and he's able to keep that connection, and that's what protects them, is the connection of them seeing each other. This is getting very, like, psychological, very thematic, right? But them looking at each other is the thing that keeps them constant in that movie, constant in that moment, right? They're stable because they're able to see each other and understand each other and connect together. Madeleine and Bond can share trauma together. And Blofeld recognizes that. And so what is Blofeld's instinct? He's going to torture Bond, and he's going to drill out his eyes. That's the next thing. So Blofeld is kind of very quick to recognize that and destroy the connection between them, and he's going to relish that. And so let's for a second just talk about that torture scene, because that torture scene is a very unusual sequence in the movie, and it is a sequence that proceeds with a little bit of, like, weird, hazy dream logic. There's a lot that's going on in that scene. Blofeld is giving us his own villain origin story, explaining his own motivations. Bond is kind of in this weird, hazy state. But what essentially happens in that scene carries over from the moment where Bond and Madeleine connect visually, right? So we know that the sequence is kicks off with Blofeld talking about what it felt like to see somebody lose their eyes during the Spectre movie, and essentially we know that's the direction that he's trying to go with Bond. The whole drilling into Bond's head thing is about removing his ability to recognize who Madeleine is. And the way the sequence kind of works, and this is so unusual for a Bond movie to do this, is it's like Bond and Madeleine overcome this threat through the power of love, right? We don't really get a real-world explanation for why this is the case, but Blofeld keeps trying to drill into Bond's head, and maybe our explanation is just that he's, like, missing the mark a little bit. It's less of a science than it is an art, but there's kind of this sense that Bond is still able to recognize Madeleine no matter what Blofeld is able to do to him, and Bond seeing Madeleine is the powerful thing that keeps them able to overcome that moment. They're able to work together and escape. And then you have this sequence where Bond is almost like, once he's out of the torture chair, he is super Bond. He has been carried on the wings of love. He is powered by the power of love. And we see again that entire escape out of Blofeld's lair, where Bond is just, you know, taking out people left and right like nobody's business, is again connected to him seeing Madeleine's eyes. Like, there's the moment where he gets out of the chair and he looks Madeleine right in the eyes. There's the moment right before he does his, like, super power-up move where he takes his gun and shoots and destroys the entire Blofeld base. That's powered by him looking at Madeleine directly. And then when they're standing up on the platform and the base explodes between them, they're facing off together. There's this sense that their connection is kind of this weird dreamlike moment where the two of them are just able to, like, ride their emotional connection, and it kind of lets everything else melt by the wayside. It's such a strange sequence. I don't know that as much as I think that's the idea that's going on there, I don't know that it's dramatically satisfying, but thematically it's really interesting, and it's really strange to see a Bond film go in that route. So let's talk about Bond's connection with Madeleine. And look, I'm looking at the runtime on this video. I know I'm already going long. I knew I was going to have a lot to say about Spectre. I apologize. So Bond's connection with Madeleine is they're both victims of trauma, and childhood trauma in particular. No Time to Die is going to pick up right at the start with a direct depiction of Madeleine's childhood trauma. Bond sees her essentially as a new Vesper, as well as a sort of shadow self. They're both people who exist in the shadow realm of assassins and murderers, and can understand each other. But for Madeleine, Bond is very clearly identified as a parallel to her father, right? Bond for her is she's kind of fixing her father. And No Time to Die doesn't run away from this idea at all. It actually reinforces it very strongly in the opening scene. But she's like, he can be the father she didn't have, the one who gave up killing to be with her, right? Like, it's in the same way that a lot of people chase their childhood wounds in their adult relationships. Madeleine is kind of trauma bonding with Bond in the sense that he's a parallel to her father, another assassin figure who can be a protector for her and also be the one who finally walks away from death. And Bond makes that choice at the end of Spectre. So in some ways, I think the age gap between these characters is part of the point. There's a sort of weird father-daughter energy to Bond and Madeleine that feels like part of the point, and the movie feels aware of that. It's drawing clear parallels in conversation, in symbolism between Bond and Mr. White, and it's making very clear that Madeleine is, at least on some level, making those connections between how Bond relates to her father. And we can talk about that a little bit more when we get into No Time to Die, which is really the movie that fills out this love story for Bond and Madeleine, because what we get here is the start of a new life for them. So when Spectre ends, we get this very interesting feeling, right? We've talked about, especially in the Casino Royale video, this bifurcation in Bond between Bond, the human being, and Bond, Secret Agent 007, this created persona. And Casino Royale ends with this moment where the Bond theme blares triumphantly as Bond's persona kind of overrides the human being. Spectre sort of flips that on its head at the end. The bifurcation is kind of healed a little bit, right? So the Bond theme now blasts to celebrate Bond's exit from the service. He has successfully thrown the gun away. He has decided to move on to a new life, a new romantic life with Madeleine, and put this life of death behind him. If the series for Daniel Craig had ended here, it was going to be a happy, jubilant ending where the trauma of the past was effectively in the rearview mirror, and there's the happy ever after in front of him. And we know that No Time to Die will change that. If throwing away the gun is Bond's doorway to happiness and peace, then picking the gun back up is going to consign him to death. And that is effectively what will happen in No Time to Die, which will be the next video in this series, and will hopefully be at least a little bit shorter than this discussion. But thank you for bearing with me. I hope you enjoyed it. Feel free to comment with anything you did or didn't agree with. Hopefully you found this interesting, and I will catch you in the next one.